Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to never miss an update from Rouse IAS. Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why, and how of newspaper analysis from the perspective of UPSC examination. Today we are going to take up Delhi edition of the Hindu newspaper dated 12th of May 2020. The articles which we are going to cover today are displayed on the screen. Let's now begin the discussion. We are very proud to announce Rouse IAS hybrid online program to prepare for Civil Services Examination 2021. The program is designed in such a manner that it will ensure same quality content at your home as we deliver here at our campuses. It also gives you the flexibility to join our campuses as and when you are ready to join the physical class program at our learning centers. Our GSI hybrid course has been designed to provide 360-degree guidance. First, our teaching covers everything from basics to advanced, and given the dynamic nature of the exam, we focus on both static as well as current affairs. Second, we focus a lot on discussions and doubt solving to be able to impart real understanding of issues important for the exam, and so we promote group discussions and make expert doubt solving available to you at all times. Third, testing is another key requirement to crack the exam. The course gives you ample practice through class tests and UPSC level test series. And finally, just before the prelims and mains exams, we help you revise everything important through our highly targeted revision modules. If you want more information, you can log on to our website and download the GSI hybrid brochure. The description of the video has the link for that as well. You can also get in touch with us using your preferred way. All the necessary details are given in the brochure, so please refer to that. From the entire team of Rouse IAS, we wish you all the very best and we will be happier to partner with you in your journey of success. Now the first news which we are going to take up is extremely important from the perspective of both prelims as well as mains examination, as it deals with a boundary dispute between India and Nepal. Now, it might seem contrary to what you have heard so far because the boundary disputes between India and its neighboring countries have been limited to China and Pakistan, mainly dealing with the matter of Aksai Chin and McMahon Line, which is the border of Arunachal Pradesh, as far as China is concerned. And as far as Pakistan is concerned, the main disputes deal with that of Siachen Glacier, Pak-administered Kashmir, and the dispute related to Sir Creek. But a construction of road has brought the dispute between India and Nepal to the fore. Now, before going into the details, it is important for us to understand why we care so much as to where the boundary is and how much area belongs to which country. Now, you know that in modern times, the countries are being governed on the basis of nation states. And territory is one of the fundamental elements of these nation states, because without a territory, an entity cannot be called a state. The notion that a state occupies a definite portion of the earth within which it exercises its exclusive authority, which means that within the areas defined by the Schedule 1 of the Constitution of India, no other authority can exercise overriding powers, is the first and foremost pillar of the formation of a state. And the exercise of such supreme authority by a state over its own territory is known in international law as territorial sovereignty, which is the right of a state to exercise over its own territory the functions of a state. And the state exercises its territorial sovereignty within its boundaries. And hence, defining boundary is very important from the perspective of governance as well as nationhood, and hence leading to a lot of disputes. Now, from the perspective of prelims examination, it is important to keep a very important data in mind, and that is related to ascending or descending order of the boundaries which the neighboring countries share with India. And hence let us know by commenting that what is the order of various neighbors as far as the length of their borders with India is concerned. Now, if you focus on the border which Nepal shares with India, it is formed by two tri-junctions. The one which is in the dispute right now is over here. That is Lipu Lake in Kalapani, which is the Nepal's border with our Uttarakhand state. The second is the tri-junction at Jinsangchuli in Nepal's east, bordering our state Sikkim. So between these two tri-junctions lies the Nepal. And this location has been brought in news because Nepal has strongly objected to the new link road from India to China, which was inaugurated by Defense Minister Rajnath Singh very recently. Now, Nepal claims that the road which India has built through Lipulekh Pass is violation of the territorial sovereignty of Nepal because Nepal thinks that that particular piece of land belongs to it. Now it's our task to make you understand that from where this confusion in interpretation over boundary comes into play. Now the western margins of the Nepal, or the border between Nepal and India on the western front, was defined by Treaty of Sogoli signed by Nepal and British East India Company in 1816, which defined the border as Kali River. As you can see in the map, Kali River can be seen flowing, and that is the international border. Now you might ask that if the boundary is so well defined, where is the problem? Now there are many ways to define an international border, and rivers are one of them. But there are two particular problems when we decide that this river is going to be a boundary between these two nations or states. Now the first problem is that rivers frequently change their path, and as you can see on the screen, this particular river has changed this much course in a matter of 10 to 15 years. And you can imagine that this treaty was signed in 1816, which is about 200 years ago. And now we can say literally that a lot of water has gone under the bridge in 200 years. So obviously once it was decided that Kali River will be international border, then the river itself has changed the course, which might lead to the confusion. And also, I would like you to focus on this particular sketch where you can see a lot of mountains basically denoting Himalayas. You know that in the upper reaches, it is very difficult to mark the exact stream which will finally become the Kali River, because there are a lot of points from where the water is emerging continuously. And hence it becomes very difficult in the upper reaches of the river to demarcate the exact origination point of a river. Now, if this is Nepal and this is India, Nepal would always want to claim this point as the source of Kali River, because if this becomes the source, then this whole territory east of this point will become Nepalese territories. Whereas India would always want to claim this point as a source of Kali River to claim the whole territory. So this is the difference of interpretation given in Treaty of Sogoli, which is creating problem right now. Now, you should not think that this is a peculiar situation between India and Nepal. This trouble over defining the exact boundary emerges in almost all the countries which have defined river as their international border. Now, why is Lipulekh Pass and the road constructed here is so important? Now, first and foremost, you know that this is the Kailash or the Kailash Mansarovar, which is a very auspicious religious place for Hindus. And right now, they have to traverse a very long distance passing through Sikkim and then traveling back to Kailash Mansarovar. Now, opening up of this road through Lipulekh Pass will shorten this distance drastically. And apart from that, control over Lipulekh allows Indian military to keep a direct watch on the movement of Chinese military across the border in Tibet. So these are the two reasons why the possession of Lipulekh is extremely important from Indian perspective. Let's now move on to the next news. A lot of articles have been published today with respect to the recent changes being carried out by various states like UP, Himachal Pradesh, Uttarakhand, Haryana, and Madhya Pradesh. For example, this article on page number 6, Equal Freedom and Forced Labor. On page number 7, Legal but not appropriate. And on page number 8, Trade unions may knock at ILO's door. So all these three separate news deal with one single step which has been taken by these states. And that is that they have carried out vast changes in their labor laws. So in this aspect, we'll go into the constitutional provisions of this matter, why these changes are being carried out, and how these states are able to carry out these changes without the involvement of the center. Then we'll also deal into the issues related to labor reform in the country, and because of which India is not able to emerge as manufacturing hub of the world, just like China did 2 or 3 decades ago. So, starting with the constitutional scheme as far as the labor is concerned, you can see that labor is enlisted in the list 3 concurrent list as entry number 22, 23, and 24. Entry 22 deals with trade unions, industrial and labor disputes. Entry 23 deals with the social aspects of labor laws. For example, social security, social insurance, employment and unemployment. Whereas entry number 24 deals with welfare of labor, including conditions of work, provident funds, employers' liability, workmen's compensation, and old age pensions. So, all the aspects dealing with the labor is dealt with in list 3 of the 7th schedule. So, in last 1 week, various states have carried out various level of changes, which we shall see later on. But the question arises that why all these states are suddenly reforming their labor laws? Because the demand for the labor reforms has been there since a long time, especially after 1991 liberalization move by the government of India. But why is it that in last 10 days that all these states are enacting these changes? Now, first and foremost, you must have seen large scale migration of laborers back to their home states. So in India, few states act as a labor suppliers which have surplus population but not enough industries and employment opportunities to employ them. And hence, a large scale migration takes place from these states to the states like Maharashtra, Gujarat, Tamil Nadu, highly industrialized states which need a lot of human labor. Now, mandatory lockdown induced due to COVID pandemic has made sure that all these industries are not able to function, and hence these migrants are now returning back to their home states. Now, this unfortunate incident has provided a window of opportunity for these states to create an employment so that when the lockdown comes to an end, these migrant laborers don't have to go back to the states where they were employed. And the second reason that why these states are in panic state to enact these changes is because after the COVID pandemic, it is expected that a lot of manufacturing is going to shift from China and especially to countries like India and other Southeast Asian economies, because there is a lot of negative sentiment with respect to China as far as its dealing and handling of COVID pandemic is concerned. Since states like UP and MP already have labor resources with them, they are thinking of reforming other hurdles which the employers or the investors face, and that is why new industries do not come up in these states. And that is why they have enacted these changes. Also, since the economic activity right now is at its lowest, and to kickstart the industrial activity just after the lockdown ends, you need to give a lot of incentives to the investors and employers. Now the question arises that if labor belongs to concurrent list and already central legislations exist, then how can states unilaterally change these laws? Although these changes have been made through notification issued by the state government, and they were able to do so because these central legislation delegate powers to the government which are in the nature of detailing some requirements. For example, the Factories Act allows state governments to exempt factories from provision of the same act during a public emergency. So you can see that the act created by the center itself gives the power to the state government to give some relaxation on certain conditions. Himachal Pradesh have utilized the provisions given in the central legislation itself, and hence they are not overriding the provisions of the central legislation. But Uttar Pradesh has taken far-reaching changes, and most of the provision enacted by UP government in the form of ordinance overrides the provision of the central legislation. And we know that for a state legislation in concurrent list to override a central legislation, it needs to be approved by president. And once president approves a state law in concurrent list, then it shall have an overriding power over the central legislation in that particular state. Now it remains to be seen how president and the central government are going to handle UP government's ordinance. But these are the provisions related to whether the states are legally empowered to make these changes or not. Now, ever since India introduced market reforms in 1990s, a long list of international organizations, investors, and general critiques of the government regulation have demanded that labor reforms must be carried out by India if it wants to attract investors. So there must be a lot of issues with the current framework through which India regulates its labor, and because of which investors are not particularly attracted to the northern states. Yes, of course, there are a lot of issues, but we have decided to go with just three of them to make it clearly understandable as to what are the main issues which plague our labor sector. Now, first and foremost is that most of the laws which govern the labor framework in our country are very archaic, antiquated, and they do not fit the current scenario of the economy. So, for example, if you look at the acts, either you will find 1936, 1948, 1965, and the latest one being 1976. So, all these laws were created at least 50 years ago, and they do not fit the current dynamic situation in which India finds itself now. Similarly, most of the labor regulations enacted by the central and state governments put a lot of constraints on the employers. And remember that these employers are investors who shell out their own money or take loans from the bank to start a business and give employment to other people. We'll demonstrate it with the help of two examples. Now, first is Industrial Disputes Act 1947. Now, a clause in Industrial Disputes Act 1947 says that if a factory employs 100 or more people, then that factory will require a prior permission to retrench, which means that if a factory wants to remove a particular person or a group of persons from job, they will have to seek prior permission from the government. Similarly, they will have to take prior permission from the government to even shut down the production. So, for example, if I'm a businessman employing more than 150 people, and if my business is not giving me profits, I just cannot close my factory without the government's permission. This is quite anti-commonsensical, but this is how India's labor laws are governed. Then similarly, a provisions in Factories Act 1948, which is extremely detrimental to the growth of industries, because it puts conditions in not only the number of hours a person can work in a week, but it also puts a condition on how much overtime a single person can do. So, for example, if a person wants to earn more, that person cannot work overtime more than what is stipulated by the state government. Similarly, Contract Labor Regulation Act 1970 does not allow user enterprises to use contract labor at will to tackle uncertain demand for their products. So what happens is that, there are times of year where the demand for a certain product goes up extremely rapidly. For example, just before the festivals. And in those limited 1 or 2 months, the employer wants to hire more and more people to ramp up the production, which they will eventually fire once the demand has come back to normal. But this kind of temporary hiring is not allowed in Indian framework. Now, another major problem is the multiplicity of laws in India. So, for example, there are around 44 central laws that govern labor sector. Now, can you imagine that a set of 44 laws, each and every one going into hundreds of pages, govern the labor framework in India? And not just that, many of them deal with just single aspect of labor. For example, if you consider payment, which is the reason why people do labor. Now, payment of any kind between the employee and employer is governed with the help of 4 different acts. Payment of Wages Act 1936, Minimum Wages Act 1948, Payment of Bonus Act 1965, and Equal Remuneration Act 1976. But you would say that what is the problem if there are 4 different laws? Now, first and foremost is that each one of them define terms in their own way because they were enacted at various different times. So, for example, the definition of the wage by this 1936 Act will be very different from what this 1976 Act will define. And this leads to confusion. And confusion leads to different interpretation of these terms by different parties. For example, union and the employer, which leads to litigation. Also, it leads to the exploitation of these provisions by the labor inspectors who then utilize these confusing norms to extort money from the employers. Also, not to forget that multiple laws means multiple license to function. Higher the licensing norms, higher the corruption. Now, what all these have done to India's economic scenario and manufacturing sector? Now, first and foremost, is that they have induced a tendency of dwarfism in Indian manufacturing sector. Now, this was a term which was given by Niti Aayog in 2019 economic survey. Now, what is dwarfism? Now, dwarfism is a very important term, which is a tendency of the firms to remain small even with time. So, for example, even a 50-year-old factory in the country will be very small in terms of the production as well as the labor. Now, obviously, you know the reason, because as soon as it will cross the 100 mark, that particular factory will not be able to function on its own will. So, the employer will deliberately try to keep his or her firm very small in order to evade the conditions put forward by these labor laws. But if you see developed countries, they do not disincentivize the larger firms, and hence, with time, their firms grow larger and larger and larger and larger, whereas in our country, the firms grow to 100 and then they try their level best to remain within that limit. And that is the reason that most of the firms in our country are old and small, which has its own set of issues, and especially the lack of proper capital investment and technology upgradation, which they are usually not able to carry on their own, and hence they get outcompeted by multinational firms. Then another major outcome of these labor laws is informalization of workforce. Now, first and foremost is that these laws are applicable only to formal sector employment, which means that if employee and employer enter into contract, only then these 44 center laws will be applicable. So what most of the employers do is that they don't enter into a contract, or they don't show that they have so much formal employed people, and hence most of the workforce has been pushed into informal sector, which is devoid of any kind of social security. Also, there is an increasing trend of hiring contractual workers, in which a large firm subcontracts the work to another firm, which is a smaller firm, which can be called as contract labor firm. Now, because contract workers are the employees of that smaller contractor and hence are not considered the workmen of the larger firm, and hence these employees are not protected by these 44 central laws. Similarly, such kinds of laws are a great obstacle to human capital formation. You know that industries play a crucial role in skill development. But as you know that our labor laws discourage firms from employing a large number of workers under permanent conditions. And more workers are being employed under contractual or casual worker category. And so firms do not invest in upgrading the skills of these informal workers, leading to lack of human capital formation in our country. So what all these things in combination do is that they reduce India's global competitiveness in manufacturing sector. And because of this reason, the industries, and especially the labor intensive industries, are shifting from China. They are not shifting to India, but rather they are shifting to even smaller economies such as Bangladesh and Vietnam, which have immensely benefited through this shift of production. Now, in the wake of COVID-19, we are hoping that industries will shift from China, and this time we should be the one who should take the maximum advantage of this shift. And for this reason, these states are carrying out changes. Although it is not important to look into all the changes which have been made by the states, but just to give you an example, UP has exempted all the industries from all kinds of labor regulations except for 2 or 3 which deal with maternity benefit and child labor regulations. Similarly, other states have done away with the number of hours a person can work in a week, and overtime clause also have been exempted. So these are the changes which have been enacted by the state governments, and they are hoping that due to these changes, these states which already have labor will get the capital, which will be able to transform these states into manufacturing powerhouse not only for the country but for the world. Let's now move on to the next news. Now this article appears on page number 7, and it is important mainly because it is written by our Vice President, Mr. M. Venkaiah Naidu. And the article is titled The Need for a Second Chamber. Only few points raised by the author in this article are important from the perspective of mains examination. But since pre is around the corner, we thought it would be a better idea to revise all the provisions related to the Rajya Sabha in our constitution. Now we at Rao's IAS believe that the aspirants should always go back to the primary source of information, which in this case is Constitution of India. We shall scan the constitution and see what are the provisions related to the Council of States, or what we call as Rajya Sabha. Now, chapter 2 of the part 5 of the constitution deals with the parliament. Just like part 3 deals with the fundamental rights, part 4 deals with directive principles, state policies. Similarly, the part 5 deals with the union, and in that chapter 2 deals with the parliament. And you can see that article 79, which is titled as Constitution of the Parliament, directly states that there shall be a parliament for the union, which shall consist of president and two houses, to be known respectively as Council of States and the House of People. So this is the article which clearly says that not only president is the part of parliament, but also there shall be two other constituents, mainly Council of States and House of People. Then article 80 determines the composition of the Council of States, and it says that 12 members shall be nominated by the president and not more than 238 representatives of the states and union territories. Now, how many members will come from which state shall be determined by the 4th schedule. So it is important to keep in mind that the 4th schedule of the Constitution of India determines the allocation of the seats in Council of States among various states. Now, the same article also lays out the fields from which the members can be nominated by the president, and those are literature, science, art, and social service. Now, as far as the method of election of the members to the Council of State is concerned, Constitution clearly lays down the representation from the states, but not from the union territories, and it is an important differentiation which you should keep in mind. For example, it says that representatives of each state in the Council of State shall be elected by the elected members of Legislative Assembly of the state in accordance with the system of proportional representation by means of single transferable vote. Now, this single transferable vote is extremely important, but that is a matter of another discussion. But if you have a look at the clause 5, it says that representatives of the union territories in Council of State shall be chosen in such a manner as Parliament may by law prescribe. So, as far as the manner of election from the states is concerned, Constitution clearly lays down that criteria. But as far as the manner of elections from the union territories are concerned, it leaves it completely on the Parliament. Now, as far as the duration of the House of Parliament is concerned, the Constitution in Article 83 clearly says that Council of States shall not be subject to dissolution, but as nearly as possible 1/3 of the members thereof shall retire as soon as may be on the expiration of every second year in accordance with the provisions made in that behalf by Parliament by law. 1/3 of the Rajya Sabha members getting retired every 2 years is a constitutional provision, and Council of States as a permanent house is also a constitutional provision. Now, as far as qualification for membership of Parliament is concerned, the only difference between Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha is that in case of Council of States, that is Rajya Sabha, the minimum age is that of 30 years, whereas in case of Lok Sabha, it is 25 years. So this is an important differentiation between Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha's preconditions to be remembered. Now, as far as sessions of Parliament, their commencement and their dissolution is concerned, the Constitution clearly gives this power to the President, and the President may from time to time prorogue both the houses or each one individually, or dissolve the House of People. And you know that there is no dissolution for Council of States as it is a permanent house. Now, as far as the chairman of the Rajya Sabha is concerned, the Constitution clearly says in Article 89, the Vice President of India shall be ex officio chairman of the Council of States. Now, ex officio means by virtue of. So, Vice President of India is a chairman of Council of States because he or she is a Vice President of India. Now, after having discussed the composition and the constitution of Rajya Sabha, it is important from the perspective of both prelims as well as mains examination to discuss what is the balance of power between Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha. So here we are not going to discuss all those scenarios where Rajya Sabha and Lok Sabha are equal. For example, anything to do with any ordinary law, which is not a money bill, its introduction, its passage, amendment to the constitution, and introduction of such a constitutional amendment bill, introduction and passage of financial bills, election and impeachment of president, and many other things. In all these aspects, Rajya Sabha and Lok Sabha have equal powers. However, it is important to note that there are few instances where Rajya Sabha dominates, and those two are created from the provisions of Constitution through Article 249 and Article 312. Now, Article 249 makes way for the Parliament to make laws in the matters related to state list. Now, generally, the Parliament cannot make laws on state list, and states cannot make lists, and states cannot make any laws in the central list or the list 1 of the 7th schedule. But the makers of the constitution had envisioned a scenario where it would be inevitable for the parliament to enact a law even in the state list, and hence they created a mechanism through Rajya Sabha. So if Rajya Sabha authorizes the parliament by passing a resolution supported by two-thirds of the members present and voting in Rajya Sabha, then Parliament becomes competent to make laws on matters dealing with the state list. It is important to note here that such a resolution remains in force for a period of 1 year only, although it can be renewed any number of times after that. Similarly, under the provisions of Article 312, Parliament can create new All India services. For example, right now, the exams which we are preparing are Indian Administrative Services, Indian Police Services. Similarly, other All India services can also be created, but only after the authorization of Rajya Sabha. So these are the two instances where Rajya Sabha has been empowered, but there are many other fields where Lok Sabha has dominant powers over Rajya Sabha, and those are: first and foremost, you should remember that Council of Ministers, which is the government, is responsible to Lok Sabha and not to Rajya Sabha. And hence, formation as well as the removal of the Council of Ministers is conducted in Lok Sabha. So basically, Rajya Sabha does not have any control over the government in that sense. Similarly, anything to do with the money bill. For example, a money bill can be introduced only in Lok Sabha and it cannot be introduced in Rajya Sabha. Similarly, Rajya Sabha cannot amend or reject a money bill, and in fact, you should know that it should return the bill to Lok Sabha within 14 days, either with recommendations or without recommendations. Also, whether a bill is a money bill or not is determined totally by the Speaker of Lok Sabha, and Rajya Sabha does not have any control over such a designation. Also, as far as the budgetary allocations are concerned, Rajya Sabha can only discuss the budget but cannot vote on demands for grants, which is exclusive privilege of Lok Sabha. And then as far as emergency provisions are concerned, you know that national emergency can be ended with a resolution. But such a resolution for the discontinuance of the national emergency can be passed only by Lok Sabha and not by Rajya Sabha. So these three are the constitutional provisions, but there are other things also which help Lok Sabha to dominate. For example, the strength of Lok Sabha is almost double that of Rajya Sabha, and hence Lok Sabha with the greater number usually wins the battle when the joint sitting is called for a stalled law. So you can see that there are some spheres where Rajya Sabha is dominating, where others Lok Sabha has been empowered. But there are three specific reasons for which Rajya Sabha was created by our constitution makers. And the first and foremost is that since India is basically a federal polity, so a mechanism was needed to ensure equilibrium between center on one hand and states on the other. And that was ensured through Council of States. Because all the members of the Rajya Sabha are basically the representatives of the states, and you know that constitution cannot be amended without the approval of the Rajya Sabha, which basically means the states. Although now we have the mechanism of Keshwanand Bharati case, which is the basic structure doctrine, but even when it did not exist, the constitution makers had made sure that whenever the central government wants to change the constitution, it will have to take majority of the states on board in form of Rajya Sabha's approval. Since all the ordinary bills have to be passed by Rajya Sabha as well to become an act, it basically acts as a revising chamber. And also the provisions of nomination of members by president into Rajya Sabha may look like a minor provision, but it is very important given the four fields which have been given in the Constitution of India. Now you know that eminent people might find it very difficult to enter into politics and especially to win an election. And hence, through this mechanism, it facilitates giving representation to eminent professionals and experts who cannot face the direct election. That way, we can ensure that experts from all these fields are represented and contribute to the policy making and lawmaking. Let's now move on to the next news. Now, this news item appears on page number 15. Mandis linked to e-platform see 65% rise in count post-lockdown. Now, in the wake of COVID-19 pandemic, you know that all the states have imposed lockdown and public transport has also been disabled, which has made it extremely difficult for the farmers and traders to carry out physical trading of agricultural commodities. Agricultural trading is still going on because farmers and traders have now shifted to this electronic means of trading. And hence, post lockdown, the number of mandis which are registered on eNAM have increased significantly, and that is by around 60 to 70%. But before going into a very short discussion dealing with eNAM, it is important for us to first understand how UPSC has asked questions in past years. And hence, we have taken two previous year questions dealing with eNAM. So in 2015, UPSC asked a very preliminary basic level question. In India, markets in agricultural produces are regulated under, and the right answer was APMC Acts or Agricultural Produce Market Committee Act enacted by various states. Then in 2017, UPSC asked a specific question about National Agriculture Market Scheme. What is our advantage or advantages of implementing the National Agriculture Market Scheme? Statement 1. It is a pan-India electronic trading portal for agricultural commodities, which is correct. The second statement says it provides the farmers access to nationwide market with prices commensurate with the quality of their produce. Now this is also correct. There are mechanisms to ensure the quality of the produce and the prices according to that, which leads us to the right answer C, both 1 and 2. So you can see in a matter of just 3 to 4 years, eNAM has been asked twice. So this is an important topic from the perspective of prelims examination. So as far as eNAM is concerned, it is a pan-India electronic trading portal which networks the existing APMC mandis to create a unified national market for agricultural commodities. So eNAM is not going to create any new mandis. It is just going to be a network of various mandis interacting and trading among each other. And hence eNAM is not a parallel marketing structure but rather a device to create a national network of physical mandis which can be accessed online. Now before moving ahead, it is important for us to first understand why we need a mechanism like eNAM or a platform like eNAM. Now it is important for you to know that all the states have enacted Agricultural Produce Marketing Committees or APMCs, under which the state is divided into several market areas, each of which is administered by a separate Agricultural Produce Marketing Committee we colloquially call as Mandi. So if this rectangle is a state, then that state is divided into these APMC areas centered by Mandis, which imposes its own marketing regulations. Now as you can see, what it does is that it fragments the whole state into very small markets, and it hinders the movement of agricultural produce from one mandi area to another. What ultimately it does at national level, it never lets the supply to meet the demand. You must have heard the news of various agricultural commodities, for example potatoes, being thrown off in one state but at the same time being sold at 100 rupees per kg in another. And that is specifically because our national market and state markets are fragmented into very small markets and they are not integrated at the national level. NAM addresses these challenges by creating a unified market through online trading platform. So let's say that these two are different states, state A and state B. The prices of potato have shot up on this state, whereas they are selling at very low prices over here. Now a trader from this mandi, if this is enlisted on eNAM, can contact a trader or a seller on this mandi where the prices are dismally low, and this exchange of goods can take place at a national level enabled by a platform known as eNAM. Joining of eNAM is not that easy after all. You will have to satisfy certain conditions to be able to enlist your mandi on eNAM platform. And that is basically an incentivization to states so that they make due changes in their laws. And first is that there should be a single trading license across the state. which means that a person should not be worried about acquiring various kinds of licenses while moving from one mandi area to another. There should be one license, enough for the whole state. Then the mandi fee should be charged only once by the state. Once that is given, the product can move within the state without worrying about any other charges. And third is that allowing for the provision of e-auction or e-trading as a mode of price discovery, because right now the APMC Act enacted by the states do not allow that, and they will have to amend those provisions to be able to enlist their mandis in eNAM. As far as the agency or the ministry is spearheading eNAM platform, it is obviously done by Ministry of Agriculture and Farmers Welfare under Government of India, and specifically by Small Farmers Agribusiness Consortium. Let's now move on to the summary for prelims examination. Now, as far as the boundary dispute of India with its neighboring countries are concerned, it is important to remember China, Pakistan and Nepal. Now, as far as China is concerned, it mainly deals with Aksai Chin as well as Arunachal Pradesh, which is known as McMahon Line. As far as Pakistan is concerned, it mainly deals with Siachen Glacier, Pakistan administered Kashmir and Sir Creek issue. And as far as Nepal is concerned, it mainly deals with the Kalapani dispute, which has just re-emerged, and Susta dispute. As far as the dispute with Sri Lanka and Bangladesh is concerned, they have already been resolved. It is also important to keep in mind that there are two routes to Mansarovar Yatra. One of them passes through Lipu Lake, where the road has been constructed. Another one passes through Sikkim and enters into China. And both of these locations are coincidentally a tri-junction between India, Nepal and China. Then, as far as labor in the Constitution of India is concerned, in the 7th schedule it finds its place in third list, which is the concurrent list, which means that both center as well as state can make laws over it. And it is found in entry 22, 23 and 24. As far as powers of Rajya Sabha is concerned, it has advantages over Lok Sabha provided by under Article 249 and 312, where it can authorize the Parliament to make a law in state list, and also it can authorize Parliament to create a new All India services respectively. Whereas Lok Sabha has few advantages over Rajya Sabha, and they mainly deal with holding the executive accountable and matters related to money bills. And finally, as far as eNAM is concerned, it is dealt by Ministry of Agriculture, and there are few conditions, and if and only when they are satisfied by the states, that they can enroll their mandis under eNAM network. Now the question for the day for 11th of May 2020 was, consider the following statements about Toda tribe. Statement 1, they are the pastoral tribes from Nagaland. Statement 2, they form particularly vulnerable tribal group of Tamil Nadu. And statement 3 read, Todas are famous for their embroideries. And 1 is obviously incorrect, and 2 and 3 are correct, which leads us to the right answer, B. The question of the day for today is, consider the following statements. In India, a second chamber was envisaged for the first time under the Morley Minto reforms proposal. Statement 2, fourth schedule of the Constitution of India provides for allocation of seats only for the states in Rajya Sabha. Which of the following statements given above is are correct? 1 only, 2 only, both 1 and 2, neither 1 nor 2.